Hey, what's up, everybody? Welcome back to People's Historian. I'm Jason Kishinev. Each episode, we read about 30 minutes of history together. I started at World War II in a People's History of the United States and worked forward, and now I will start at the chapter before where I started and work backwards. So, reading backwards. Halta to city that brought people working 100,000 of walkout. No, I'm just kidding. Anyway, we are reading chapter 15 and we'll work backwards from there. And let's dig in, shall we? Chapter 15, Self-Help in Hard Times. The war was hardly over. It was February 1919. The IWW leadership was in jail, but the IWW idea of the general strike became reality for 5 days in Seattle, Washington, when a walkout of 100,000 working people brought the city to a halt. It began with 35,000 shipyard workers striking for a wage increase. They appealed for a support to the Seattle Central Labor Council, which recommended a citywide strike. And in 2 weeks, 110 locals, mostly American Federation of Labor, only a few IWW, voted to strike. The rank and file of each striking local elected 3 members to a general strike committee, and on February 6th, 1919, at 10 o'clock a.m., the strike began. Unity was not easy to achieve. The IWW locals were in tension with the AFL locals. Japanese locals were admitted to the General Strike Committee but were not given a vote. Still, 60,000 union members were out and 40,000 other workers joined in sympathy. Seattle workers had a radical tradition. From what I know of Seattle, still do. During the war, the president of the Seattle AFL, a socialist, was imprisoned for opposing the draft, was tortured, and there were great labor rallies in the streets to protest. The city now stopped functioning, except for activities organized by the strikers to provide essential needs. Firemen agreed to stay on the job. Laundry workers handled only hospital laundry. Vehicles authorized to move carried signs exempted by the General Strike Committee. 35 neighborhood milk stations were set up. Every day, 30,000 meals were prepared in large kitchens, then transported to halls all over the city, and served cafeteria style, with strikers paying 25 cents a meal, the general public 35 cents a meal. People were allowed to eat as much as they wanted of the beef stew, spaghetti, bread, and coffee. A labor ward veterans guard was organized to keep the peace. On the blackboard at one of its headquarters was written, "The purpose of this organization is to preserve law and order without the use of force. No volunteer will have any police power or be allowed to carry weapons of any sort, but to use persuasion only." During the strike, crime in the city decreased. The commander of the U.S. Army detachment sent into the area told the strikers committee that in 40 years of military experience, he hadn't seen so quiet and orderly a city. A poem printed in the Seattle Union Record, a daily newspaper put out by labor people, by someone named Anise. And this is kind of long, so I'll try to read it quickly. What scares them most is that nothing happens. They are ready for disturbances. They have machine guns and soldiers, but this smiling silence is uncanny. The businessmen don't understand that sort of weapon. It is your smile that is upsetting. Their reliance on artillery, brother. It is the garbage wagons that go along the street marked exempt by strike committee. It is the milk stations that are getting better daily, and the 300 war veterans of labor handling the crowds without guns. For these things speak of a new power and a new world, and they do not feel it, that they do not feel at home in. The mayor swore in 2,400 special deputies, most of them students at the University of Washington. Almost 1,000 sailors and Marines were brought into the city by the U.S. government. The general strike ended after 5 days, according to the General Strike Committee, because of pressure from the international officers of the various unions, as well as the difficulties of living in a shut-down city. The strike had been peaceful, but when it was over, there were raids and arrests. On the Socialist Party headquarters, on a printing plant, 39 members of the IWW were jailed as ringleaders of anarchy. In Centralia, Washington, where the IWW had been organizing lumber workers, the lumber interests made plans to get rid of the IWW. On November 11th, 1919, Armistice Day, the Legion paraded through town with rubber hoses and gas pipes, and the IWW prepared for an attack. When the Legion passed the IWW hall, shots were fired. It is unclear who fired first. They stormed the hall. There was more firing, and 3 Legion men were killed. Inside the headquarters was an IWW member, a lumberjack named Frank Everett, who had been in France as a soldier while the IWW national leaders were on trial for obstructing the war effort. Everett was in army uniform and carrying a rifle. He emptied it into the crowd, dropped it, and ran for the woods, followed by a mob. He started to wade across the river, found the current too strong, turned, shot the leading man dead, threw his gun into the river, and fought the mob with his fists. They dragged him back to town behind an automobile, suspended him from a telegraph pole, took him down, locked him in jail. That night his jailhouse door was broken down. He was dragged out, put on the floor of a car, his genitals were cut off, and then he was taken to a bridge, hanged, and his body riddled with bullets. Somebody really wanted him to suffer. Jeez. Overkill much? No one was ever arrested for Everett's murder, but 11 Wobblies were put on trial for killing an American Legion leader during the parade, and 6 of them spent 15 years in prison. Why such a reaction to the general strike, to the organizing of the Wobblies? A statement by the mayor of Seattle suggests that the establishment feared not just the strike itself, but what it symbolized. He said, "The so-called sympathetic Seattle strike was an attempted revolution. That there was no violence does not alter that fact. The intent, openly and covertly announced, was for the overthrow of the industrial system, here first, then everywhere. True, there were no flashing guns, no bombs, no killings. Revolution, I repeat, doesn't need violence. The general strike as practiced in Seattle is of itself the weapon of revolution, all the more dangerous because quiet. To succeed, it must suspend everything, stop the entire life stream of a community. That is to say, it puts the government out of operation. And that is all there is to revolt, no matter how achieved." Furthermore, the Seattle general strike took place in the midst of a wave of post-war rebellions all over the world. A writer in The Nation commented that year, "The most extraordinary phenomenon of the present time is the unprecedented revolt of the rank and file. In Russia, it has dethroned the Tsar. In Korea and India and Egypt and Ireland, it keeps up an unyielding resistance to political tyranny. In England, it brought about the railway strike. against the judgment of the men's own executives in Seattle and San Francisco. It has resulted in the stevedores' recent refusal to handle arms or supplies destined for the overthrow of the Soviet government. In one district of Illinois, it manifested itself in a resolution of striking miners, unanimously requesting their state executive to go to hell. In Pittsburgh, according to Mr. Gompers, it compelled the reluctant American Federation officers to call the steel strike, lest the control pass into the hands of the IWWs and other radicals. In New York, it brought about the longshoremen's strike and kept the men out in defiance of union officials and caused the upheaval in the printing trade, which the international officers, even though the employers worked hand in glove with them, were completely unable to control. The common man, losing faith in the old leadership, has experienced a new access of self-confidence, or at least a new recklessness, a readiness to take chances on its own account. Authority cannot any longer be imposed from above. It comes automatically from below. This is Hermione, in case you haven't seen her in any of my videos before. She's been in a couple now. In the street mills of western Pennsylvania later in 1919, where men worked 12 hours a day, 6 days a week, doing exhausting work under intense heat. 100,000 steel workers were signed up in 20 different AFL craft unions. A national committee attempting to tie them together in their organizing drive found in the summer of 1919, the men are letting it be known that if we do not do something for them, they will take the matter into their own hands. The National Council was getting telegrams like the one from the Johnstown Steel Workers Council. Unless the National Committee authorizes a national strike vote to be taken this week, we will be compelled to go on strike here alone. William Z. Foster, later a communist leader, at this time Secretary-Treasurer to the National Committee in charge of organizing, received a telegram from organizers in the Youngstown district. We cannot be expected to meet the enraged workers who will consider us traitors if strike is postponed. There was pressure from President Woodrow Wilson and Samuel Gompers, AFL president, to postpone the strike, but the steelworkers were too insistent. And in September 1919, not only the 100,000 Union men, but 250,000 others went out on strike. The sheriff of Allegheny County swore in as deputies 5,000 employees of U.S. Steel who had not gone on strike, and announced that outdoor meetings would be forbidden. A report of the Interchurch World Movement, made at the time, said, in Monison, the policy of the state police was simply to club men off the streets and drive them into their homes. In Braddock, when a striker was clubbed in the street, he would be taken to jail, kept there overnight. Many of those arrested in Newcastle were ordered not to be released until the strike was over. The Department of Justice moved in, carrying out raids on workers who were aliens, holding them for deportation. At Gary, Indiana, federal troops were sent in. Other factors operated against the strikers. Most were recent immigrants of many nationalities, many languages. Sherman Service Incorporated, hired by the steel corporations to break the strike, instructed its men in South Chicago, we want you to stir up as much bad feeling as you possibly can between the Serbians and the Italians. I pronounced it that way on purpose. Spread data among the Serbians that the Italians are going back to work. urge them to go back to work, or the Italians will get their jobs. More than 30,000 black workers were brought into the area as strike breakers. They had been excluded from AFL unions and so felt no loyalty to unionism. There's a piece of the black civil rights that I hadn't really absorbed before, that they weren't allowed to join unions in the early 20th century. As the strike dragged on, the mood of defeat spread, and workers began to drift back to work. After 10 weeks, the number of strikers was down to 110,000. And then the National Committee called the strike off. In the year following the war, 120,000 textile workers struck in New England and New Jersey, and 30,000 silk workers struck in Paterson, New Jersey. In Boston, the police went out on strike. And in New York, cigar makers, shirt makers, carpenters, bakers, teamsters, and barbers were all out on strike. In Chicago, do you mind? In Chicago, the press reported more strikes and lookouts accompany the midsummer heat than ever known before at any one time. 5,000 workers at International Harvester and 5,000 city workers were in the streets. When the 20s began, however, the situation seemed under control. The IWW was destroyed, the Socialist Party falling apart, the strikes were beaten down by force, and the economy was doing just well enough for just enough people to prevent mass rebellion. Seems like I've been through some times where just enough people were doing just well enough to prevent mass rebellion. Congress in the 20s put an end to the dangerous, turbulent flood of immigrants, 14 million between 1900 and 1920, by passing laws setting immigration quotas. The quotas favored Anglo-Saxons, kept out black and yellow people. Limited severely the coming of Latinos, Slavs, Jews. No African country could send more than 100 people. 100 was the limit for China, for Bulgaria, for Palestine. 34,007 could come from England. 34,007? Or Northern Ireland. But only 3,845 from Italy. 51,227 from Germany, but only 124 from Lithuania. 28,567 from the Irish Free State, but only 2,248 from Russia. These are some arbitrary numbers, aren't they? 28,567? Why not 22,570 or 22,565? Beats me. The Ku Klux Klan was revived in the 1920s, and it spread into the North. By 1924, it had 4.5 million members. The half on here looks weird. Every time I see it, I think it's an 8. By 1924, the Klan had 4.5 million members. The NAACP seemed helpless in the face of mob violence and race hatred everywhere. The impossibility of a black person's ever being considered equal in white America was the theme of the nationalist movement led in the 1920s by Marcus Garvey. He preached black pride, racial separation, and a return to Africa, which to him held the only hope for black unity and survival. But Garvey's movement, inspiring as it was to some blacks, could not make much headway against the powerful white supremacy currents of the post-war decade. There was some truth to the standard picture of the 20s as a time of prosperity and fun. The Jazz Age, the Roaring 20s. Unemployment was down from 4,270,000 in 1921 to a little over 2 million in 1927. The general level of wages for workers rose. Some farmers made a lot of money. The 40% of all families who made over $2,000 a year could buy new gadgets, autos, radios, refrigerators. Millions of people were not doing badly. Stop it! And they could shut out of the picture the others. The tenant farmers, black and white, the immigrant families in the big cities, either without work or not making enough to get the basic necessities. Not to mention the New York Yankees in the 1920s kicked some butt, right? But prosperity was concentrated at the top, as it usually is. While from 1922 to 1929, real wages in manufacturing went up per capita 1.4% a year. The holders of common stocks, she rolls over, but if I touch her belly, she will hurt me bad. I mean, if I, pet her belly. While from 1922 to 1929, real wages in manufacturing went up per capita 1.4% a year. The holders of common stocks gained 16.4% a year. 6 million families, 42% of the total, made less than $1,000 a year. 1/10% of the families at the top received as much income as 42% of the families at the bottom, according to a report of the Brookings Institution. Every year in the 1920s, about 25,000 workers were killed on the job, and 100,000 permanently disabled. 2 million people in New York City lived in tenements condemned as fire traps. The country was full of little industrial towns like Muncie, Indiana, where, according to Robert and Helen Lind, the class systems was revealed by the time people got up in the morning. For 2/3 of the city's families, the father gets up in the dark in winter, eats hastily in the kitchen in the gray dawn, and is at work from an hour to 2.25 hours before his children have to be at school. There were enough well-off people to push the others into the background. And with the rich controlling the means of dispensing information, who could tell? Somebody told me just the other day that Howard Zinn never mentions that the rich control the means of dispensing information. And if you're watching, he just did. Granted, it was in the 1920s. Still. Historian Merle Curti observed about the 20s, it was in fact only the upper 10% of the population that enjoyed a marked increase in real income. But the protests which such facts normally have evoked could not make themselves widely or effectively felt. This was in part the result of the grand strategy of the major political parties. In part, it was the result of the fact that almost all of the chief avenues to mass opinion were now controlled by large-scale publishing industries. Sound familiar? Did you know that 6% of all the media is, did you know that all of the major media is owned by 6 corporations? All of it? Some writers tried to break through. Theodore Dreiser, Sinclair Lewis, Lewis Mumford, F. Scott Fitzgerald, in an article, Echoes of the Jazz Age, said, "It was borrowed time anyway, the whole upper tenth of a nation living with the insouciance of a grand duke and the casualness of chorus girls." He saw ominous signs amid the prosperity, drunkenness, unhappiness, violence. A classmate killed his wife and himself on Long Island. Another tumbled accidentally from a skyscraper in Philadelphia. Another purposefully from a skyscraper in New York. One was killed in a speakeasy in Chicago. Another was beaten to death in a speakeasy in New York and crawled home to the Princeton Club to die. Still another had his skull crushed by a maniac's axe in an insane asylum where he was confined. Is that supposed to be F. Scott Fitzgerald that wrote that? Why would a maniac in an asylum have an axe? Why would he be allowed to have an axe? Sinclair Lewis captured the false sense of prosperity, the shallow pleasure of the new gadgets for the middle classes in his novel Babbitt. It was the best of nationally advertised and quantitatively produced alarm clocks with all the modern attachments, including cathedral chime, intermittent alarm, and a phosphorescent dial. Babbitt was proud of being awakened by such a rich device. Socially, it was almost as creditable as buying expensive cord tires. He sulkily admitted now that there was no more escape, but he lay and detested the grind of the real estate business and disliked his family and disliked himself for disliking them. Women had finally, after long agitation, won the right to vote in 1920 with the passage of the 19th Amendment, but voting was still a middle-class and upper-class activity. Eleanor Flexner, recounting the history of the movement, says the effect of female suffrage was that women have shown the same tendency to divide along orthodox party lines as male voters. Few political figures spoke out for the poor of the 20s. One was Fiorello LaGuardia, presumably who the New York airport is named after, huh? One was Fiorello LaGuardia, a congressman from a district of poor immigrants in East Harlem, who ran oddly on both socialist and Republican tickets. That is odd. In the mid-20s, he was made aware by people in his district of the high price of meat. When LaGuardia asked Secretary of Agriculture William Jardine to investigate the high price of meat, the secretary sent him a pamphlet on how to use meat economically. LaGuardia wrote back, "I asked for help and you sent me a bulletin. The people of New York City cannot feed their children on department bulletins. Your bulletin are of no use to the tenement dwellers of this great city. The housewives of New York have been trained by hard experience on the economical use of meat. What we want is the help of your department on the meat profiteers who are keeping the hard-working people of this city from obtaining proper nourishment." And that's why they named an airport after him. During the presidencies of Harding and Coolidge in the 20s, the Secretary of the Treasury was Andrew Mellon, one of the richest men in America. In 1923, Congress was presented with the Mellon Plan, calling for what looked like a general reduction of income taxes, except that the top income brackets would have their tax rates lowered from 50% to 25%, while the lowest income group would have theirs lowered from 4% to 3%. A few congressmen from working class districts spoke against this bill, like William P. Connery of Massachusetts. "I am not going to have my people who work in the shoe factories of Lynn and in the mills in Lawrence and the leather industry of Peabody in these days of so-called Republican prosperity when they are working but 3 days in the week think that I am in accord with the provisions of this bill. When I see a provision in this Mellon tax bill which is going to save Mr. Mellon himself $800,000 on his income tax and his brother $600,000 on his, I cannot give it my support. The Mellon Plan passed. In 1928, LaGuardia toured the poorer districts of New York and said, "I confess I was not prepared for what I actually saw. It seemed almost incredible that such conditions of poverty could really exist." And I think let's call that the episode. We'll stop there. Tune in next time. We'll pick it up. And I want to thank you for joining me. Really, thank you for joining me. Hit the like and subscribe button if you would. Hit the notification bell to keep getting notified every time I make a video. And we'll see you next time. Bye. Bye. Oh, yeah, she's growling. Bye.